Well, hey guys, we are excited to introduce to you today Senior Deputy District Attorney Erin Varley she is located here in Harrisburg. Today we have Erin at our restoration home, and we wanted to take the opportunity to not only introduce Erin and the incredible work that she is doing, but we want to start unpacking a little bit about what human trafficking looks like here locally and who are the movers and shakers, those who are actively combating this issue. As we know, many are often asking, who is involved in the fight against human trafficking in Pennsylvania and here in Central PA? What can we do to get involved? And we thought it would be helpful for you to start meeting some of those influencers in the fight against human trafficking here in our region. And so we are very excited to have you meet one of our close colleagues in the field, Erin Varley. And Erin, if you could share a little bit about the work that you're doing here in Dauphin County and maybe how you even got started in the field.
Sure. Like Jordan said, my name's Erin Varley, and thank you so much for having me in your beautiful restoration home. I am in charge of the Dauphin County Human Trafficking Task Force. And as Jordan said, there's a ton of movers and shakers in the area. So we try and work collaboratively with kind of all walks of life to make sure that we're serving victims of trafficking, survivors of trafficking in every way possible. So our trafficking task force is comprised of one investigator, at least from every major department in our county. And we also have a number of probation officers that supervise either our offenders or our survivors through their treatment programs or through whatever programming that they are participating in. And we also work with members of the community, especially Green Light Operation, to help our survivors transition to a life away from trafficking. And we try and do that as collaboratively as possible and to make sure that everything we do is with the survivor in mind. So we adopt the victim-centric approach to how we handle investigations, prosecutions, and seeing individuals through the restorative process.
That's huge. And Erin, to brag on you a little bit, that's not a very common process that we see throughout the state, even the nation, as it comes to that collaborative victim-centered approach. And maybe for those who are listening who aren't as familiar with what a victim-centered approach is, could you share a little bit about what that looks like?
Sure. It is handling any stage of the criminal justice system and beyond with the best interests of the victim in mind. With a lot of prosecutions and investigations, the primary focus generally is to obtain the evidence you need and proceed with that investigation and prosecution to go after the offender. But in the trafficking world, the offender has inflicted some of the most horrific crimes against an individual, and the survivor is dealing with trauma that is extraordinarily complex. They have probably been in the life for years and years prior to any type of intervention or themselves wanting to leave the life, which means that the trauma that they're facing affects their ability to come forward, affects their trust in law enforcement to hear what is happening. They might not want to participate in the investigative process or in the prosecution process. Standing up to your trafficker in court requires a ton of strength and courage and a lot of treatment along the way. So when we handle an investigation, we try to handle an investigation in a way that corroborates what a victim is saying with the hope that potentially the victim or survivor would never have to take the stand. If they do have to take the stand, then we try and work with them throughout the process as much as possible. And if we feel that their testimony or their participation in the process will be detrimental to them, then we evaluate whether or not we even have them participate in the process and try and seek criminal investigations, prosecutions in other ways, perhaps with different charges or different modes of criminality. And as part of that victim-centric approach in making sure that we are setting up the victim for success down the road, that includes finding out what it is that led them to a life of trafficking and how we can keep them out of that life moving forward. And in doing that, we do everything we can to make sure that the survivor has agency over those decisions. So we work with the individual to figure out what treatment plans are best, what resources are available, and they have input that we take very seriously into how they want the criminal justice part of the recovery component to proceed.
We admire that so much, and that's a big reason for us. We have very much long admired the work that you have been doing and leading the charge in Dauphin County, and would love to soon unpack a little bit of what that's looked like with launching the Human Trafficking Task Force. But something that you shared about the element of you're not forcing survivors to testify or to even prosecute, for that matter. That's, folks, that's a pretty rare thing to see when it comes to the legal system at times, because I'm sure as many, you've encountered it in the educational side of things. I know Greenlight, we've had the same, where a lot of times people ask, why aren't you just, having the survivors file those reports and sue their trafficker, go after them, file those charges? And I think you encapsulated that so well, where you were sharing that you're giving the choice to them. For so long, they have not had say in what has happened to them, and from their care to the way that they've been treated. And then, we're hoping that for those who are listening, it's something that stands out to you, that choice is a big part, because if we're also then removing any choice from them when it comes to what we look at is their healing and recovery and chance for justice, in some ways it makes us no different from those who exploited them. Yes, there are some differences, but that removal of choice, it's big. And then, would you say that you would see almost more of a willingness and a drive to push that forward when they do have a say in the matter and that choice? What's the difference that you've seen in systems that don't take that victim-centered approach versus the approach that the Dauphin County Human Trafficking Task Force takes?
So what we have found is when we offer survivors agency, both in their treatment programs and how we proceed in the criminal justice system, is that we address the treatment component first. And often when they become more stable, when they realize that that's our top priority, that builds the trust and rapport. And over time, we tend to see them become more and more willing to come forward with information and ultimately to take the stand and to testify, which takes a lot of bravery, as you know, which then leads to a cleaner, more efficient prosecution down the road, and the ability of the survivor to withstand things like cross-examination on the stand. So we've actually, I feel, have had more success with a more patient, victim-centric approach in bringing justice for the victims, at least through the criminal justice system, and then forcing them to take the stand or not listening to how they feel about the process, because we tend to lose those individuals sometimes if we were to force them to. So seeing them have that agency and realize that they have power over their trafficker and believing in themselves is huge. And it takes time, but it's a great journey to see.
We admire that greatly. And you're right, it takes that time, but the payoff is huge when they can trust you. And for once they can start to trust the system. And from the law enforcement officials you work with, you mentioned that you have investigators that you're connecting with all throughout the county, and I'm sure state as well. And what would you say you've noticed as a difference from, with law enforcement that have been trained on human trafficking and how to take a victim-centered approach, and how that plays into that whole system you just explained, where we naturally have that point where we're first meeting, and actually, I'm going to take a step back. The victim survivor terminology, if you could explain the difference between utilizing that. I know we get that question a lot. Do we call them victims? Do we call them survivors? And then I'd love to jump back into the difference we see with law enforcement who has been trained on it and handling these cases with a victim-centered approach, and the long-term impact that has through the whole process. But could you first explain the victim survivor terminology?
Sure. We try to use survivor outside of the criminal justice system whenever possible. I often get caught up in it because within the criminal justice system, legally they are deemed a victim. So sometimes I get caught up in the terminology myself. When I refer to those individuals in court, I do have to utilize the word victim. And usually at sentencing is when I have the freedom to utilize the term survivor. But survivor recognizes that they are more than a victim. They have come forward. They have overcome so many barriers, and it is a word that empowers or gives strength to what the person has gone through. That they are not just a victim, quote unquote. They have stepped forward. They have taken steps, even if they've had setbacks along the way. We always try to use survivor because that is what they are. They have survived, in my opinion, the worst crime imaginable, and they are still chugging along, doing everything they can, and they are the toughest group of individuals I've ever encountered.
They are. And that's true. I think a lot of times people have an idea that when an individual has been identified in that trafficking situation and the help is offered to them, that there is an eagerness to jump through to the next step, which is what many of us might coin that, they're leaving the trafficking situation, their trafficker and all of that. And that's not always the case. We, to Erin's point, they have experienced one of the worst crimes imaginable. And there is a lot of trust that needs to be rebuilt. And the first point of interaction for many can be that point where they're interacting with law enforcement. Now it's different for everyone's story. It could be a community member, a family member. We know it's different for all, but could you explain a little bit of that victim-centered approach when it comes to law enforcement and police and the significance that has and what you're seeing as even the follow-through with survivors leading into prosecution to just that level of trust and frankly just the treating them like a person, maybe for the first time. I'm getting ahead of myself, but yeah, can you share some of that?
Sure. Our task force members have been trained at this point, a couple of years in, pretty extensively on trafficking, recognizing it, investigating it. And they also have heard from me many times how we want to handle the victim-centric approach. And they are told over and over again, and they have now been spreading it to their counterparts in their departments, it takes 7 good interactions with law enforcement or a victim services provider or the system to want to get out of that life. Yeah. When you are working with an individual, perhaps even just trying to get their story, it's, again, the magic number of 7. Usually it's 7 interviews to get the full story. Yeah. When you are working with them as they work to leave the life, usually it's 7 setbacks before they leave for good. So helping them understand that when you first encounter a survivor, it is going to be a long road for everyone involved, but especially the survivor. Yeah. And supporting them through that process and meeting them where they are in their process is very helpful. So what we encourage our investigators to do, and they've really taken this on well, is before they have an interaction with a survivor, we will usually send our advocate out first. Mm-hmm. And it'll just be a get to know you type of session. And then we start to build rapport with the investigator. Yeah. And we make sure when we conduct interviews that they're not 7 hours long. We match their energy. If they want to stop, we stop. Sometimes they go away for a while and they come back. And the biggest thing is making sure they know that they have a place that they can come back to, because eventually they will. When it comes to the agency that we do our very best to have our survivors employ throughout the process and how they feel about things, the investigators adjust their investigations accordingly. And it may hamper their investigations in the beginning. Yeah. And we handpicked a very passionate group of people who sometimes just get so fired up over what the trafficker has done and they want to address it instantly. Mm-hmm. But reminding them that addressing it instantly doesn't necessarily help the survivor, helps bring that balance back. Mm-hmm. So hopefully they can get their goal of getting the trafficker off the street, but not at the expense of our survivors that we're working with.
That's big. It's a very strategic move. You're playing the long game rather than the game of a quick return, or one that might get a lot of quick attention, but then, at the expense of the trust that's being built with those survivors, and the sense of just collaboration that's taking place. So you guys are taking a long strategic approach, and you touched on something that I know, Erin, you and I have connected on a good bit, and that immediate return, that instant gratification that a lot of times we all seek in various ways of life. And when it comes to trafficking, and from extractions to assisting with a survivor who's self-reported, oftentimes there's a desire for that instant gratification, giving them help immediately, but not always giving them the choice. So that agency that you keep bringing up is just such a vital piece of the long game, so to speak. But we have had, I know with Greenlight at least, in some of our seminars, I'll never forget one in particular that we did. And it was at a church that was right off of the turnpike. And now we've had a few of those, so it's not identifying any particular one. But I'll never forget this particular speaking engagement where, following it, a group of very well-intended ladies came forward. And they said, okay, we heard what you said. Trafficking is happening here. It's prevalent. They're needing help. What are ways that we can get involved? And they said, we were thinking about this. And during the break, we came up with a plan. They're like, we all have minivans, all of us ladies here. They're like, we're not far from the truck stop. We're going to go to this truck stop with our minivans. And we're going to look for these women, throw them in the vans, and take them to the nearest police station. I remember audibly laughing in that moment as you and I are like smirking. We're like, oh my gosh. It is very well intended, and we don't mean to discourage people from getting involved in doing something, but there is a right approach and there's a wrong approach. And so with that, we can laugh at that. That's a very obvious, probably not the best approach to take. But it's very real, where people maybe see a trafficking situation or they suspect something is happening and they want to intervene. And so with that, maybe they're not giving a whole lot of choice in the situation. And they're going in themselves, whether they're planning their own sting operation as citizens. Maybe they are, looking for that opportunity to throw them in their van and take them somewhere. We've had those moments where we just shake our heads and we're like, why? Can you explain some of the reasons that is not an approach that we would recommend? And maybe even some of the implications for taking an approach like that?
Sure. Yes, we don't recommend getting involved in investigating or surveilling or trying to force survivors into a different situation. One of the things that survivors tell us all the time is they are taught from day one by their trafficker that law enforcement won't help them, won't believe them. And that's one of the reasons that they don't come forward. And it's part of the isolation tactics that traffickers use. And if some individual that, a survivor doesn't know jumps in and pushes them into a van, they are not going to see that as something that is good or safe for them. So that puts the survivors in a bad situation. They will not see you as somebody that they can trust because you've taken away what little autonomy they may have had. By placing them in a situation, whether it's physically or through treatment or whatever. We also, I had said earlier, we meet individuals where they are. Mm-hmm. If they are not at a place where they feel that they are ready to leave that life, accept treatment, go through restoration, then dragging them to a treatment facility will just mean that they leave. Mm-hmm. And then that could potentially cause somebody to go backwards in their recovery process. They may have been close due to maybe something their trafficker had done, or they were close to rock bottom, or just experienced something that made them think, maybe this is not the life for me. Mm-hmm. But if you disrupt their own internal healing process, then that usually leads to individuals going backwards. Yeah. It's also unsafe for you. Please don't do that. A lot of traffickers are exceedingly violent. It's very unclear what situation you'd be putting yourself in. Weapons are often involved. Narcotics or ways to inject narcotics into systems are involved. It's just absolutely not safe. Yeah. We've also had instances where well-intentioned people put themselves into these types of situations and ruin longer term investigations. Like I said before, the trafficking investigations take a long period of time. So it is quite possible that your actions may interfere surveillance that's going on or force our hand in terms of making an arrest before we're ready, which then puts the victim or survivor in a situation where they would have to take the stand and we're trying to build corroborative evidence. Just overall, if you see or suspect something, I recommend that you contact local law enforcement and that you contact the trafficking hotline. We do get those tips and we act on them, at least in our county, and I know other counties have systems set up as well. It's safer for everyone, it doesn't ruin investigations, and it also, again, allows individuals with the proper training to come in and assist the survivor.
Yeah, I think it's easy. There's actually something I was going to ask you was if people suspect it, what do they do? And we hope that you're hearing that these reports are taken very seriously. If you are somebody who's listening that is maybe in a county that does not have a task force, which is most counties in Pennsylvania right now, we would encourage you, connect with the district attorneys about having a task force, but report it. We don't want to put yourself in danger. And there's an element too where you could be sued for interfering. And we don't want that for somebody who is very well-intended. And our hope is that it's coming from a heart of wanting to help, but we don't want that to harm you or to harm the individual you're trying to assist. And so, Erin, there's that piece that we have been seeing. You guys formed the task force a few years ago. There has been a recent push in media talking about counties that have the most cases and trends where there are a lot of reports. So those are the most problematic towns and cities, where there are other counties and cities throughout Pennsylvania that have 0 reports. And I know for our team, we often say, let's flip that script a little bit and look at those areas that have those high reports and see what anti-trafficking efforts are being made. And oftentimes you're seeing a task force in place, you're seeing sting operations and some form of education and prevention methods that are happening. And in our brain, we're like, this is good because that means something's happening. It's uncovering what has for so long sat in darkness and been unseen or ignored. And so we often put the challenge out in the communities that we speak to that have those 0 cases of what is the anti-trafficking response? What does that look like? Because it can be comfortable to see there's 0. We don't have to deal with it. But it exists in about every community, county, all of that. We know it's there. It's just likely not been identified yet. So can you explain a little bit of what prompted the task force launching, some of the process that you all went through, and how that need has been just so evident to have a task force where if I recall, when we first met you guys, you were at 3 active cases of human trafficking at that point in time. It would have been around maybe 2019, 2020, somewhere around there. And you guys have increased that quite a bit throughout the years. What are you guys, if you're able to share? Sure. How many cases do you currently have?
We currently are hovering around 100. I would say half of them might not be prosecutable, but we have survivors working with us. But in terms of how many are under investigation, we have approximately 100. Last year, we filed, I believe, 6-ish human trafficking sets of charges. And you're right, we started at 0. We had kind of just been aware of the topic, aware it was probably happening. There were some individuals that had passion for addressing it. And once we started to look into how we wanted to handle it in our county, what kind of reporting systems we wanted, protocols we wanted in place, right when we were about to start gathering our detectives, we got kind of our first case, which was a doozy, to say the least, and we learned by fire. But that is what taught us all of the ways that trafficking affects individuals. It does not happen in isolation. And by building based upon what we learned, training and education, we started doing a better screening process of child lines that come in. And basically it was once people knew that a report could be made, reports started coming in at a much higher capacity because they knew who to send them to.
Yeah.
So I would say, we talk about this all the time, there's nowhere where trafficking isn't occurring. It is just, is it being recognized and reported versus whether it's actually occurring?
Yeah. It's like ripping off a Band-Aid in a way, but, you know, and it takes a lot of preparation. There was a lot of preparation that you all did before even publicly launching that the task force was in existence. So what would you say to anyone who's listening and recognizing that, oh, there's not a task force or maybe even a system in place where they live on how to report human trafficking, how to handle those cases, and you guys did a lot of work. It's not for the faint of heart, that's for sure. But what would you say to those who are hearing this and wanting to see that for their community? What next steps would you recommend to them?
I would recommend reaching out to DA's offices. The Attorney General's office has just launched a trafficking unit statewide. They might be a great liaison, especially in counties with fewer personnel and resources.
Yeah.
I know that's a huge barrier for folks. And one of the things I would say is, if you want to get involved, educate yourself first. Go to trainings, hear people that are in the field, because there's also a lot of misinformation out there. So if you want to address the problem, don't be part of the problem by doing things the incorrect way. Yeah. Work with your law enforcement, encourage a multidisciplinary approach. And if your law enforcement is not able to do so, there are now statewide resources available as well. And go where your talents are. Not every single person has the talents, time, or experience to investigate a trafficking case. But we work with banks, which Jordan has connected us to, that teach banking and life skills to our survivors. Or if your skill is farming or whatever it may be, you can be part of the restorative process. Just because you're not part of the investigative process, it doesn't mean you're not helping. In fact, our biggest need is in the restorative process, and that's why we're so grateful that Greenlight is a partner of ours.
We're grateful for that too. Erin, thank you for all that you shared. And what would you say, you touched on it a little bit, but what is the best way for anyone who is here locally in the Dauphin County area? How could they best support the task force and the efforts that you all are doing? And what are some of the needs that you all currently have that just a community member might be able to assist with?
Our biggest need is with the restoration side of things. So we have connections with treatment programs and everything like that. But when it comes to life skills, jobs, long-term things that our survivor needs, we need individuals willing to either take our survivors in or train them in a job field or be willing to educate them in some way. Driving lessons, things that we take for granted every single day. Our survivors do not have the skills because of what their traffickers have done to them to learn, and they don't have the people willing to help. So I think volunteering with Greenlight to do life skills or whatever it is that your gift is, I would say use your gift, your talent, your treasure in an educated, informed way to assist individuals. And if that's fundraising, then that's great. The fight against trafficking is expensive, and yeah,
it is. So. Well, Erin, thank you so much for joining us today. I always love our connections and just the wealth of knowledge that you have that you're willing to share. And so thank you for joining us, and thank you, listeners, for listening. And we hope you're getting a little bit of a better understanding of all the different elements that are at play when it comes to human trafficking, recognizing a case to all the way through a prosecution. And then there's the restorative process, which we didn't touch on fully today, but we would say stay tuned. We would love to share a little bit more about what that restorative process can look like for survivors. And if you would like some more information or details on how to learn more about human trafficking, schedule a seminar for your workplace, your church, or club, whatever that might be, you're welcome to visit Greenlight's website, which is greenlightoperation.org. And we would love to get you plugged in. And so thank you for listening. Erin, thank you again.
Thank you.
It's always just such a pleasure to connect with you.
Same here.